Michael's parents abandoned him when he was a bit over a year old. He ended up in an orphanage. He wasn't very talkative and felt like an outcast because he wasn't loved. He always told everyone what he thought. He never lied or kept quiet if he saw something unfair. He got beat up many times since many people did not appreciate his honesty. After he left the orphanage, Michael went to work in a big city. He did what he could, got a driver's license, rented an apartment, and got a job as a taxi driver. His fight for honesty and fairness did not always help him. His manager didn't like him, and the only reason he didn't fire him was because Michael was an excellent worker. One day he was driving in heavy rain and was caught in a traffic jam, so he was afraid he would be late for another client. While sitting in traffic, Michael had time to think about his life. Even though he had a foothold here, he was unhappy and consumed by loneliness. He decided to take a shortcut and turn down an alley. Suddenly, a girl jumped in front of the car. He slammed on the brakes and cursed loudly. She stood in front of him, blocking his path. He got out of the car. "What are you doing? Do you have a death wish?" Michael screamed. He saw that she was pregnant and felt bad for yelling. She slowly slid down to the curb and started crying. Michael felt bad. "Hey, what's wrong? Get in the car or you'll catch a cold." Michael helped her up. To defuse the situation, Michael extended his hand and said with a smile, "I'm Michael. I'm a taxi driver." She wiped her tears and said something unexpected. "I'm Helen, and I'm an ex-con." Why did she say that? She noticed Michael's confusion and said, "Don't worry, I'm an ex-con, and yes, women also go to prison." "I'm not worried. Life happens and no one's to blame. I don't even know what will happen to me tomorrow," Michael said. "Well, I can't predict the future, but I'm sure that you'll have a new life starting soon," she said unexpectedly. Michael looked at his passenger in the rearview mirror. Oh yeah, a new one. Jobless and penniless. He thought about his client he was late for. That would just give his manager a reason. "How far along?" Michael asked, pointing at her stomach. 7 months. I'm due soon." "I have no kids or wife. I'm completely alone, and probably will stay that way," Michael said sadly. "Why? You've got your life ahead of you. You're a nice person, and that's important," Helen answered. Helen asked Michael to take her to an address and said she'd pay him. "Don't worry about it. I don't need that." Michael wondered how a pregnant ex-con could have money in the first place. Then he remembered passengers who would arrive at an address and say they'd bring out the money, but would just disappear. "I'm not broke. I can really pay you. I just need to go to the bank first," she said as if she could read his mind. "I said you don't need to. I'll take you where you need to go." When they arrived, Michael was surprised that it was at a bank and decided to tell a joke. He said, "I hope you're not going to rob it because there's not enough to make me an accomplice." She waved her hand, got out, and went inside. As he was leaving, Michael was imagining that there was going to be sirens blaring and that the police were coming, but everything was quiet. He was really late for his client, but hoped that the client wouldn't complain and no one would know. In the evening, when he got to the parking lot, Michael noticed lots of rude faces and his coworker smiling. The manager called him into his office. He was rejoicing. Because of his helplessness and worthlessness, Michael felt uncomfortable. It turned out Michael's car had a GPS on it, and the manager knew that he was late and that he went to a bank not on the route. Michael thought he'd be yelled at, but he was just fired. Now he was at the bus stop, waiting to get home. He remembered Helen, who said his life would change. Well, it did, and it got worse. Michael barely kept himself from crying. He needed to look for a new job, and fast. All he could find was a job helping with construction. Michael couldn't get Helen out of his head. He always wondered how she was, what happened to her, and where she was. There was a knock at his door one evening. Michael thought it would be his neighbor, a little old woman across the hall who was always interested in his life and would just come to chat. He opened the door and was shocked. It was Helen. "Hi, surprised? It was hard to find you." There was a well-dressed woman standing there. "Are you going to invite me in?" Helen said. "Yes, of course. Come in." Michael still couldn't believe his eyes, but was happy to see her. "I'm making dinner. Would you like some?" Michael asked. She nodded. Over dinner, Michael told Helen about the day he was late and that he got fired. Then he told her about his childhood in the orphanage and how he wound up in the city. When Michael finished, Helen lowered her head and said, "Now it's my turn, I guess, but it's a long story. That is, if you want to hear it." "Of course I do. I have tomorrow off, so I'm in no rush," he said. Helen's mom had died, and her father quickly got remarried. Her father was well off and had a business he was planning to sell. Helen immediately disliked her stepmom, Alexa. But no matter how hard Helen tried to talk her father out of marriage, he didn't want to listen and was disappointed. Helen had a small company that she put all her energy into, and that was promising. Alexa had a grown son, David, who, at her father's request, Helen hired. David started scheming behind Helen's back and then told the authorities, blaming her, so she wound up in prison. Her father suddenly died, and Helen's company went to David and Alexa. While in prison, Helen learned that her father sold his company in time and put all the money in an account in her name. "What about that?" Michael asked, pointing at her belly. She sighed. "That might be the most embarrassing thing I've done in my life. I needed to get out of prison quickly to get my company back and investigate my father's death. He was a strong man who never complained about his health. I'm sure Alexa was involved. So I got close to the warden for mutual help. He helped me get out on parole, but I got pregnant. I'm going to have twin boys. I couldn't get rid of them, so I decided to do whatever I could do to make them happy." She hugged her stomach and lowered her eyes. "Do you think poorly of me?" she asked Michael. Michael thought about when he was abandoned. This frail girl, despite her life situation, was ready to fight for her unplanned children. Michael hugged Helen and said, "Not at all. You can always count on me." She hugged him as tightly as she could. It was already late. Michael suggested spending the night. He put her in the bedroom and went to sleep on the couch. Helen woke up the next morning to a pleasant smell in the apartment. She quietly exited the bedroom to see Michael rushing around the kitchen. He looked at her gently and warmly and said, "Good morning. I'm making pancakes. I hope you like them." Helen felt amazing and wanted every morning to feel like this. Over breakfast, Helen said she needed help. She would soon give birth and had lots to do to get her company back and to expose Alexa and David. Michael agreed. He started looking for people that could help. He found a private investigator and a lawyer and brought them up to speed. One day, Helen called Michael and said she was having contractions. Michael rushed to her. It turned out to be a false alarm, but it was best for Helen to stay in the hospital with the doctors. While leaving the hospital, Michael suddenly realized that Helen and her unborn children were part of his life, part of him, and he wanted to always be with them. So, the next day, right in the hospital, Michael proposed and promised to do everything to make them happy. Helen cried from happiness. The PI and the lawyer were able to find out what happened quickly and get the evidence of fraud. Everything was ready for trial. David turned out to be a coward. After getting the summons, he quickly agreed to work with the investigation. He told them everything and blamed his mother for it all. He didn't know the details of Helen's father's death, but said he suspected she was involved. Unfortunately, there was no direct evidence that Alexa killed her husband, but the evidence to accuse her of fraud was abundant. Alexa was arrested, and David, considering his assistance, was given a conditional sentence. Helen gave birth to 2 beautiful boys. As soon as they got home with the kids, they were married. Using the money from her father, Helen bought a house and a car for their large family. She noticed that Michael was worried about something. He said he was worried he wouldn't find a good job. He had to quit his job in construction since he spent all this time on the investigation. But now it was over, and he had to provide for his family. Helen laughed and hugged Michael. "I love you so much, Michael. You have a job. We have a company that Alexa and David almost destroyed, and now we have to get it back on track. You put in so much work getting it back for me, so now you have to run it by my side. We will work together and raise our kids."